As we sit here 20 years after the Crime Act was passed, at a time when crime rates are the lowest they've been in a generation, it's really hard to remember the mood of the country in the early 1990s when the crime bill was being debated. I moved to Washington to head up NIJ after spending 4 years as Deputy Commissioner of the New York City Police Department, the General Counsel's position. And in my hometown, we were experiencing the height of the crack epidemic. Murders were going through the roof, well over 2,000. It was a very scary time. And this wasn't only in New York City, this was the reality in urban America, and therefore the reality of the nation. And this reality gave impetus to a very robust discussion in our Congress about what to do about crime, and it helped to propel Bill Clinton into the presidency because he ran for office with a pledge that in his administration there would be another 100,000 police officers added to the police forces of the country, paid for by federal taxpayers to give localities the wherewithal to do something about crime. He also embraced the concept of community policing. And he also said that there were other things that should be done in addition to policing that became the components of the '94 Crime Act. Now, at the same time, the outgoing Republican administration had made certain commitments about what it thought should be done about violent crime, mostly centered on increasing the use of prisons. So these two ideas came together in the Congress at a time when there was an urgency to do something. And both ideas survived in the final version of the '94 Crime Act and went on to be implemented by the appropriate agencies. But the important starting point here in thinking about the history of the Act is that it was born at a time of crisis. And the federal government responded. And we're now here, 20 years later, trying to assess that response to see whether it was effective or not. I'm in a very unique position here, just as an individual criminal justice expert, because I was present at the signing of the '94 Crime Act, spent 6 years at the Justice Department overseeing its implementation, and now 20 years later have just completed service as chair of the consensus panel convened by the National Academy of Sciences to ask what are the consequences of the increase in incarceration in the United States. And one of our findings is that the states were given incentives by the '94 Crime Act to be more punitive in their sentence policies, driving up the rates of incarceration. So I've spent a lot of time recently just thinking about this question and realizing the damage done to the country by the '94 Crime Act and the larger sort of political conversation about being tough on crime, because we've more than quadrupled the rate of incarceration over the last 40 years, not the 20 years since the Crime Act was passed, but going back to 1972 when the prison buildup started, we've been on this policy journey that's unprecedented in our nation's history, unique in the world, where we now have so many people in prison, 1 in 100 people in prison or jail in America, that we have to ask ourselves, how did we get here? And the '94 Crime Act played a role in that story, a not insignificant role in that story, by taking the tough on crime rhetoric that was coming at us from the right, embracing it under a Democratic administration, and providing financial incentives to the states to get tougher on crime by putting people who are already going to prison in prison for a longer period of time and increasing the use of mandatory minimums and encouraging states to be tough on drug crimes. So those three drivers, which constitute the National Academy finding in terms of how did we get here, those three drivers, mandatory minimums, making long sentences longer, and a very punitive drug policy, were all enabled, facilitated, encouraged, and in some cases paid for by the '94 Crime Act.